The moment work lost its mask. There's a moment when work stops pretending, when the language, the titles, and the routines fall away, revealing what the job actually is. Not what it promises, not what it represents, just what it demands every single day. This story begins at that moment in 97, when work finally lost its mask. For a long time, the structure had held, the role sounded right, the responsibilities looked meaningful. The language surrounding the work suggested impact and importance. And in a world where careers are often defined by presentation as much as substance, that was enough to keep going. This story matters today because many people remain loyal to the image of their work long after the reality has changed. The gap between what a job promises to be and what it actually requires can widen for years before anyone acknowledges it. The mask didn't fall off suddenly. It slipped slowly, through repetition, through patterns that became impossible to ignore, meetings that recycled the same conversations, goals that were reframed, not redefined, progress that existed mostly in language rather than outcome. What once felt purposeful began to feel performative. At first, they assumed this was normal, that every job eventually loses its shine. That maturity means learning to separate meaning from effort. But the discomfort grew sharper with time. It wasn't boredom. It was dissonance. The growing gap between what the work claimed to be and what it actually required. The reveal began with a small realization. They noticed how often they were explaining the value of their work instead of experiencing it. How frequently they relied on narratives to justify why it mattered. The work itself no longer spoke clearly. It needed interpretation, defense, framing. That was the moment something shifted. They understood they weren't tired of working. They were tired of pretending. And once that truth surfaced, the mask could no longer stay in place. Once the mask slipped, everything underneath felt exposed. The routines that once felt purposeful now felt mechanical. The language that framed the work as meaningful sounded hollow when repeated out loud. They began to notice how much energy went into maintaining the story of the job, rather than doing work that justified the story on its own. The conflict deepened as they tried to reconcile reality with expectation. They had invested time, identity, and credibility into this role. Admitting the disconnect felt like admitting failure. 97, even though nothing had technically gone wrong. The system worked. The outcomes existed. The problem was quieter and harder to explain. It lived in the space between what the role looked like from the outside and what it felt like from the inside, a space that grew wider every day. They paid closer attention to how their days were actually spent, not the titles, not the mission statements, just the lived experience. Decision after decision was shaped by optics rather than impact. Meetings optimized for alignment instead of progress. Success measured by consensus instead of results. The mask wasn't deception. 97, it was design. The structure of the role was built to maintain appearances, and anyone inside it was expected to participate in that maintenance as part of the job itself. The tension peaked when they realized how long they had been compensating for this gap, framing tasks to feel important, translating effort into meaning through explanation, carrying the weight of justification themselves. The work no longer carried its own gravity. It needed constant interpretation to feel worthwhile. That realization was unsettling. It meant the dissatisfaction wasn't personal. It wasn't burnout or lack of gratitude. It was structural. The role required them to perform belief rather than build value. And once they saw that clearly, it became impossible to unsee. They weren't failing the job. The job was asking them to pretend. And that request carried a cost they could no longer ignore. The cost of pretending accumulated quietly. Each day required a small compromise, 97 softening opinions, reframing outcomes, aligning language with expectations rather than truth. None of it felt dramatic in isolation, but together, it created a steady erosion of integrity. They were no longer lying outright. They were translating themselves. The conflict reached its peak as they recognized how deeply this translation had shaped their behavior. They spoke carefully, avoided clarity that might disrupt consensus, chose safety and expression over honesty and contribution. The mask wasn't just covering the work anymore. 97, it was shaping who they were allowed to be within it. Moments of resistance surfaced. A direct question they wanted to ask, but didn't. An idea they diluted to fit the room. A decision made for optics instead of effectiveness. Each moment felt small, but each carried weight. Over time, the accumulation became exhausting. Not because the work was hard, 97, but because it required constant self-editing. The emotional peak arrived during a moment of unexpected clarity. They realized the job wasn't asking them to grow. It was asking them to maintain a narrative. Progress wasn't measured by improvement, but by consistency with the story everyone agreed to tell. And that realization stripped away the last illusion. This wasn't about effort or skill. It was about alignment. The work no longer allowed them to show up fully, honestly, or creatively. It rewarded conformity over contribution. And once they named that truth, staying felt less like commitment and more like compromise. The mask had done its job. It had protected appearances, preserved stability, but it had also obscured reality long enough to cost them clarity. And now that clarity had arrived, it demanded something difficult, not rebellion, but honesty. The kind of honesty that doesn't demand immediate upheaval, but refuses to participate in pretense any longer. And honesty, once reclaimed, would change how they approached every decision that followed. Honesty didn't demand a dramatic exit. It demanded a reckoning. They stopped explaining away discomfort and started listening to it. The job had become unbearable, 97, but it had become untrue. And living with that truth changed how they evaluated every option ahead. They began asking sharper questions, not about advancement or security, but about integrity. Could this work still hold their voice without dilution? Could they contribute without translation? Could they respect the person they were becoming while continuing to perform a role built on pretense? Each question narrowed the future with surprise and clarity, and each answer pointed in the same direction. What followed wasn't impulsive. It was deliberate. They stopped investing energy into preserving the mask. They redirected attention toward work that could stand on substance alone. Some doors closed quietly. Others opened slowly. The path forward didn't announce itself, 97, but it no longer required pretending. Looking back, they understood the moment work lost its mask wasn't a loss. It was a correction. It stripped away narratives that once felt necessary and revealed what actually mattered. Doing work that doesn't need explanation to feel meaningful. Work that speaks through impact, not interpretation. The lesson stayed with them long after the transition. Any role can look important long enough to trap you. Any story can sound convincing until lived long enough to feel hollow. The only reliable measure is whether the work allows you to show up honestly, without constant self-editing. When work loses its mask, it doesn't always collapse. Sometimes it clarifies. And once clarity replaces pretense, the future becomes simpler, 97, even if it isn't easier. The willingness to see work as it truly is, rather than as it presents itself, becomes a foundation for every honest choice that follows. Subscribe to join the journey. The